May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always found acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning. Today marks the second Sunday of the season of Lent. And we always associate Lent with performing acts of self-denial and sacrificial ways of consciously integrating those disciplines into our lives. And we get all of this from gospel passages such as the one that's appointed today from Mark's gospel. And in this particular gospel, Jesus is in his teaching ministry. That is to say, there are some things about Jesus where he's in his pastoral mode. And so he goes about touching people and healing them of great illnesses, both in body and in spirit. And in other sections, Jesus acts in a different way. And today is one of those sections where he's acting as a teacher. He's instructing, first of all, his disciples, and then later on, whoever else will listen to him. The text in Mark just simply says the crowd. But what he's doing is he's laying the foundation for a teaching ministry that I believe holds the greatest promise for humanity, and which we have tapped even 2,000 years later, only a smidgen. We have not even begun to appropriate the depth of meaning and the quality of life that the Sermon on the Mount brings with it. We are like in the Dark Ages as Christians, 2,000 years later. But we better continue to try and pay attention to what the teachings of Jesus are all about, and not only try to learn what they're all about, but even more importantly, try to live them out. And so in today's gospel passage from Mark, Jesus is teaching his disciples who are faithful Jews something which they do not want to hear, which they absolutely reject from their souls on out. Jesus is saying that the Son of Man, that is to say Jesus, must endure great rejection and suffering at the hands of the chief priests and the elders and the scribes in the Jewish community. And that runs contrary to everything that these disciples were taught as good and faithful Jews in their synagogues, growing up in their equivalent of Sunday school. That the Messiah would be the fulfillment of the Jewish religion, acclaimed by people who represent those in authority in the synagogues and even in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes, and those who work as a living as Levites, as priests in the synagogues. So that was the one thing that Jesus was saying that the apostles just simply couldn't get their arms around. Here is Jesus, the one that they see as the Messiah, and he's saying he will not be well received by those in authority within Judaism. And if that's not enough, he also teaches them that he will not only endure great suffering, but he will be killed. Again, what he taps into is the greatest fear that human beings have, which is the fear of dying, physically dying. The denial of death motivates us to live in sometimes great ways and sometimes not so great ways. But what Jesus says reminds the apostles that they too will die someday, and if the Son of God is to be killed, and they're friends with the Son of God, then they may die in a similar manner. They would be murdered or killed by those in authority. So for those two reasons, the apostles, as you can understand fully, are about to correct Jesus They're going to say to him, no, 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 that's not what the Messiah is all about, being rejected. And no, 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 the Messiah is not going to be killed, but rather will live forever. And so Peter, the greatest, I think, the boldest of all of the apostles, he begins to rebuke Jesus, and Jesus will have none of it. It's the mark of Jesus' own vision of who he is and how strong he gathers his strength from within, that he's able then to just turn the apple cart around and to rebuke Peter. And what he says is, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus saw Peter as an evil person. It's an interesting aside to note that there is an interpretation in the Midrash, in the Jewish interpretation of their scriptures, that talks about Satan not as a fallen angel who is banished from heaven, but rather as an angel who continues in relationship with God, but whose role it is to oppose whatever God is saying or willing or doing. So if God says yes, it was the role of Satan to say no. And there was this kind of give and take between God and Satan, according to some interpreters of the Jewish law. And I think it was in that sense that Jesus was saying to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," because Jesus was saying in very direct, very open, and very well understood language exactly what did occur to him. And Peter was acting like Satan, opposing him, saying, "No, no, 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 that's not going to happen." And Jesus dismisses Peter. "Get behind me, Satan." And then he calls all of the crowd. And he gets all of the crowd, I don't know how many, maybe 100, maybe 1,000, maybe several thousand, but at least he gets a large number of people. And he starts instructing them as well. Again, he expands his teaching ministry beyond the disciples to a larger audience constantly. And when he talks to all of the others, he talks in terms of paradox. Something that is a wonderful way of getting people's attention, because there's a kind of conundrum about it. There's a puzzlement about it. What do you mean when you say, "If you want to become my followers, let yourselves deny yourselves and take up your cross and follow Jesus? Those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake in the Gospels will find it." You see how that paradox is in Jesus' teaching ministry. And what he's getting at, of course, is something that only now we're struggling with on a conscious level and trying to make some sense out of it, which is that we know at what level that the greatest thing that we can do on the face of the earth is to develop those eternal qualities that are from within and that originate with God. And yet, by the same token, we are engaged in a somewhat tumultuous battle internally with false gods. Those gods that don't give life, but just want more and more and require more and more until they eat us up, until they eat us alive. That's the danger, I think, that we live in today, of having false gods, particularly the god of materialism, which says that $100 million is not enough to live on. Now, given that, who is the more sane person? The companies that tell us to buy more, or Jesus, who tells us to get in touch with that which is enduring and lasting and fulfilling and satisfying? There was a wonderful program. I saw it 3 times this past week. A documentary on PBS about the Amish. How many of you happened to see it? Many of you, if you can possibly still see it. I would strongly recommend that you see this documentary. And it's ironic that we see it on television.
Which they can't see.
Because the Amish, of course, don't have it. You can clearly drive in the county of Lancaster in Pennsylvania, or in Indiana, or wherever else they are located. And you know who is Amish and who isn't because they don't have any kind of electric lines running to their farmhouses. And they don't believe in television. In this documentary, there was an Amish man that they asked to speak to a group of folks like us who were touring Lancaster County and wanted to learn more about the Amish way of life. And so they asked this Amish man in the documentary, tell us the difference between you and us. And he said, well, I'd like a show of hands. How many of you own a television set? Everybody raised their hand, all of these tourists. He said, how many of you watch television? Everybody said, I do. How many of you find something objectionable on television that you should not be watching or your children should not be watching? Everybody raised their hand. And the Amish man said, how many of you throw out your television? Get rid of your television because it contains something objectionable. Nobody raised their hand in the Amish man. That's the difference. We do something about it. Well, the Amish have warts, and this documentary program on PBS does reveal some of those warts. Something that they do that is just heart-rending. A practice called shunning. And yet, the program also shows something about the Amish that is absolutely admirable, and that I wish I possessed more of, and that this congregation possessed more of, and that the Episcopal Church possessed more of, and that the Protestant faith in America possessed more of. And that is a sense of knowing that Jesus is their Lord, is their Master. We all run around like chasing cats, trying to get everybody together because we're not clear enough about who Jesus is in our lives. And for the Amish people, they know that at the core, it doesn't take even an ordained person in their midst to tell them that Jesus is the center, the absolute core of who they belong to, and who they listen to, and who they try their best to follow. It's very difficult, and the Amish prove that suffering is involved in following Jesus. But I must say it's very admirable. They don't even have to have a building to worship in. They don't even have to have paid clergy, because they know who the authority figure is already in their lives. And it's not one of their members, it's Jesus, who is in everyone. That's what this morning's gospel passage is in part about. To be a follower of Jesus, we've got to get rid of all of these side gods, these side shows in our lives, and focus down upon that which is really important. And come to grips, I don't care what age you are, with the question, who is your Lord? Who is your Master? And it's very unpopular to ask that question today in an age of such highly individualistic ways of behaving. The Amish, and particularly the Amish women, have to struggle mightily with this notion of surrender. Now, I'm not saying that that's altogether healthy as practiced in the Amish community, but I am saying that we have a long ways to go to really put into action what it means to surrender to the will of God in our lives. individually, as a parish, as a denomination, as mainline Christians. And that's precisely what Jesus talks about in this morning's gospel passage. That if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, if you're really going to surrender, you're not going to do what we all too frequently do, which is try and end run around pain and suffering and even death. But if you want to be a follower of Jesus, now here is the seeming bad news. You're going to have to go through pain and suffering directly and straightly. Not try to get around it as if life were just a bowl of cherries. If you do it that way, you will be a very shallow person. What Jesus says is, do the hard part. Go through pain and suffering and see if you do it properly, if you are led by God. See if you're not transformed. See if it doesn't make a difference in your life. See if you don't become more compassionate, not only of others, but of yourself. Therefore, cancer is not to be feared. But if you get cancer, and God forbid that you do, at least there's a way of working through it. If you have a terminal disease, it's an opportunity for growth. Now that's Christianity. Not trying to do an end run around all of the different ways of suffering that we encounter in life, but to grasp it, to hold it, and to say the power of God is even greater than this grip that cancer has over me. And if that's not enough, Jesus proved it by his own life and by his own death and by the saving grace of God in terms of resurrection. That's the power of this morning's gospel. The seeming good news is transformed again in a paradoxical way. The seeming bad news, rather, is transformed into good news. So that we come together as a faith community. Broken, yes, but alive, because we are living by the power of the grace of God. And there's nothing greater than the grace of God. We have a gift, a tremendous gift, right at our disposal. And may God grant us the will to exercise that gift of faith, that gift of becoming a follower of Jesus, that gift of embracing everything that Jesus teaches us, including pain and suffering in our lives, so that we may live in eternity. Amen. Amen. Now let us stand.